What if I told you that the most powerful story you'll ever hear today doesn't begin with success, but with silence? Not with applause, but with hunger? Not with a hero, but with a broken boy who had nothing except a fire inside him that refused to die? This isn't a fairy tale. It's not fiction. It's raw. It's real. And it just might remind you of parts of your story you've tried to forget. You're about to witness how one life, bruised, abandoned, invisible, turned pain into power and failures into footsteps. How a voice that once trembled grew into an echo heard across the world, without fame, without wealth, without shortcuts. This is not just a story. This is a journey. And if you've ever felt lost, stuck, forgotten, then don't move. Don't scroll. Don't blink. Because what you're about to hear could change everything. Welcome to BookLeesh, where stories aren't just told, they're lived. The wind that night had a strange voice. It whispered truths no one wanted to hear and carried the scent of broken dreams. Far away in a nameless village where streetlights barely lit the dust, a boy named Arav stood on the edge of a rooftop, staring into a future that looked no different from the shadows behind him. He had never worn shoes that weren't secondhand, never owned a bag that didn't once belong to someone richer, and never known what it meant to be enough. Yet, his eyes carried a hunger that couldn't be bought, only built. His father was a factory worker, quiet, hardened, defeated. Every night, the man would sit beside the old transistor, drink black tea, and never speak of dreams. His mother cooked in silence, her hands always bruised, her back always bent. School was a privilege for Arav, but hunger had its own curriculum. He would study with borrowed books and torn pages, sometimes beneath streetlights, sometimes in the dim glow of a candle melted into a broken plate. One day, his teacher called him out. "You always score well, Arav, but kids like you don't go far. Life's already decided what you'll become." Arav didn't reply, but something inside him cracked. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pain. It was a realization that no one was going to carry him across the storm. He had to build wings out of whatever scraps life threw his way. He began waking up before the sun. He read not just to learn, but to escape. He devoured biographies, learned English through broken YouTube videos at cyber cafes, and practiced speeches by whispering to himself when no one was looking. He learned to fail quietly and rise silently. But life wasn't ready to applaud him yet. His father lost his job. His school fees became a luxury. His books were taken back. His dreams now had price tags, and his pockets were empty. That evening, he didn't cry. He walked 6 kilometers to a college campus he had once seen in a newspaper, one where speakers stood tall, students looked free, and the future smelled of ambition. He stood outside the gate, watched them pass, and whispered to himself, "One day, I won't just be here. I'll be someone they'll remember." But the real war had just begun. He picked up part-time jobs. Cleaner, helper, delivery boy. Sometimes all in one day. He worked through the nights, read during tea breaks, and wrote on the back of paper bills. Every moment became a negotiation between survival and success. At 18, he cracked a local scholarship exam with a rank that shocked everyone, including himself. He was admitted to a college in the city. Yet, the city didn't welcome him like he imagined. The hostel smelled of damp clothes and forgotten ambitions. Students mocked his accent, laughed at his worn-out shoes, and dismissed him with a single glance. But every laugh they threw at him became another brick in the fire he was building. He joined a debate club with trembling hands. He stammered through his first speech. The judges looked unimpressed. His own teammates suggested he quit. That night, he stood in front of a mirror and spoke until his voice gave out. Not because he wanted to prove them wrong, but because he was tired of proving himself right only in his head. Days turned into months. Every failure etched something deeper into him, resilience that couldn't be taught, clarity that couldn't be borrowed. Then came the national competition. His college didn't nominate him. He nominated himself. They laughed. He registered anyway. And when the spotlight fell on him that day, when thousands watched, he didn't remember any speech he wrote. He spoke of his father, who taught him silence, of his mother, who taught him endurance, of the streets that taught him to never mistake pity for respect. The crowd didn't clap at first. They stood. He didn't just win the competition. He rewrote the rules. From there, his story began to echo. Motivational talks, invitations, corporate halls, TEDx stages. Each time he walked on stage, his past walked with him, not as baggage, but as a badge. Years later, the same teacher who once told him he wouldn't go far invited him as a guest speaker. He walked into that classroom wearing a tailored suit, but still carried the same fire in his eyes. And when he finished his talk, a little boy raised his hand and asked, "Sir, how did you know you'd make it?" Arav smiled, looked down for a second, then replied, "I didn't. I just knew no one else was going to fight for my dreams." That's when everyone understood. Greatness isn't born in comfort. It is carved in struggle, baptized in isolation, and crowned only after the war is long over. And somewhere in the corner of that hall, a new story had begun. Years passed. Arav's name echoed beyond classrooms and auditoriums. His journey was no longer just his own. It became a torch others began to follow. But with every level he climbed, the mountain only grew steeper. He launched a nonprofit to support underprivileged students. His goal wasn't charity, it was transformation. He wanted to turn forgotten children into forces the world couldn't ignore. Every child he helped was a mirror of who he once was. Their broken shoes, their hungry eyes, their quiet desperation. He saw himself in every one of them. But then came the betrayal. One of his closest teammates, someone he trusted like a brother, began siphoning funds. It started small, a missed receipt, an unrecorded transaction. Then one day, a large donor called, angry that the scholarship money hadn't reached the students. Arav froze. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much. This couldn't happen. But it had. He confronted the man, and the response pierced deeper than theft. "You're just a glorified orphan with a mic, Arav. You think inspiration pays the bills?" That night, Arav walked for hours. The city lights didn't glow, they burned. The past whispered, "Maybe you've flown too high." But a quiet voice inside said, "No, this is where strength begins again." He refunded the donors from his own speaking fees, shut down the nonprofit temporarily, took every insult, every doubt, every whisper that said, "He's done for." But he wasn't done. He was sharpening. He rebuilt from scratch, this time with stricter processes, verified systems, and a board he vetted like a fortress. He didn't just survive betrayal, he turned it into his greatest lesson. And when he reopened the nonprofit, it grew 10 times bigger. Arav had now trained over 1,000 students across villages and small towns, not just to pass exams, but to own their lives. One of his students, Mina, once stood trembling just like he had at that debate stage years ago. She came from a family that thought girls shouldn't speak up. Arav trained her anyway. She went on to become the first girl in her district to win a national leadership award. But just when things seemed unshakable, fate tested him again. His mother, his strength fell seriously ill. The same woman who once walked barefoot to feed him now lay in a hospital bed fighting for breath. Arav had the money now, the doctors, the access. But life doesn't care about what you have, it tests what you believe. Her condition worsened. One night, as he held her hand, she whispered something that cut through him like no stage or award ever could. "Beta, you've helped so many children see tomorrow. Now just sit here with me tonight." That was the only time in years he missed a speech. She passed that night, peacefully, holding his hand. He didn't speak for a month. Not on stage, not online, not to the world that waited for his words. People assumed he was broken. But what they didn't know was that during those silent nights, Arav was writing something not for the world, but for his mother. A book. Her story. His story. Their journey from silence to voice. When the book was finally released, it didn't just become a bestseller. It became a movement. Roots and Wings, that was the title. It reminded readers that no matter how high you rise, your roots define your strength. And your wings, your purpose, define your legacy. Then came the international invitation. The United Nations. They wanted him to speak about educational transformation and youth empowerment. As he stood on that global stage, lights flashing, cameras blinking, powerful leaders listening, he thought of the night he stood outside the college gate as a teenage boy, penniless but full of fire. He looked into the crowd and began not with statistics, not with strategy, but with a simple line. I come from a place where dreams don't wait for permission. Silence. And then the longest standing ovation of his life. Back home, a new scholarship was named after his mother. And in the corner of every village classroom his nonprofit supported, a quote was painted in bold, permanent ink. You are not your circumstances. You are your choices. And so Arav's story didn't end. It echoed. It multiplied. It became not a chapter, but a spark, one that would light thousands of futures that were once waiting in the dark. After his global recognition, Arav's days became crowded with interviews, awards, flights, meetings. The world now called him a visionary, a changemaker. Headlines praised his resilience, biographies were drafted, and podcasts fought over his next appearance. But fame, like fog, can sometimes blur your own reflection. He began to notice something shifting. In the rush of building his empire of hope, in the applause that followed him everywhere, something personal was fading. He no longer remembered the last time he had a meal with his childhood friend Ravi, the one who once shared half a chapati with him during their worst days. He missed his younger sister's wedding due to a keynote in London. He didn't even notice that the small rented room where he first dreamed big had been demolished. And one rainy night, alone in his lavish apartment, surrounded by awards and untouched dinner trays, he sat on the floor and wept. Not because he was lost, but because he couldn't remember who he had been before the world put a label on him. The next morning, he packed a single bag and disappeared. He didn't inform his staff, or his board, or even the media. No cameras followed. No headlines tracked him. For the next 3 months, Arav wandered through villages, small towns, mountains, and railway stations without an agenda. Just watching, listening, sitting with strangers. He helped an old mechanic in a remote town fix punctured tires. He taught kids in a tribal school to recite poems. He sat with a widow who ran a tea stall and laughed for the first time in years. None of them knew he was Arav. They just called him Via. And it was during those nights, sleeping under the stars, washing his clothes in hand pumps, borrowing smiles from people who had nothing, that he found his center again. One day, in a village that wasn't even on Google Maps, he found a small broken chalkboard with just one sentence written in crooked handwriting. Someday, someone will believe in me. He stood there for hours, staring. Then, quietly, he pulled out his notebook and began to write again. When he returned, he wasn't the same. He dismantled parts of his organization. Not because they were failing, but because they had lost touch with what made them powerful: connection. He replaced policies with stories, restructured his teams to be closer to the ground than to glass buildings. He made every leader in his network spend a month in the field each year. No laptops, no suits, just service. Some criticized him, said he was downgrading, that he was risking institutional growth. But Arav didn't care for institutional growth anymore. He was chasing soul growth. One such day, he walked into a correctional facility for juveniles, boys branded criminals before they turned 18. No one clapped when he entered. They didn't care who he was. He sat on the floor with them and told them about the first time he stole a book. how he hid it in his shirt because he couldn't afford it, how guilt ate him for weeks until he returned it quietly one night. One of the boys, with tattooed arms and a permanent scowl, asked, "So what changed you?" Arav smiled. "Nothing changed me. I just decided I wasn't born for escape. I was born for impact." Silence. Then the scowling boy asked if he could be taught to read again. And just like that, one more forgotten fire got lit. But Arav's greatest test was still waiting. A corporate giant approached him with a multi-million-dollar offer to turn his nonprofit into a global educational franchise. Promises of mass reach, tech-enabled classrooms, celebrity endorsements. The board urged him to accept. It could change millions of lives faster. The deal was almost done. But one night, a letter arrived. It was from Mina, the same girl he once mentored. She now led her own initiative, teaching girls in her village self-defense and storytelling. Her words cut deep. If we franchise dreams too fast, we forget to water their roots. Don't let scale steal the soul. He sat in silence for hours. The next day, Arav walked away from the deal. The world called him crazy. He didn't mind. Because he knew something they didn't. Real change is not loud. It's not viral. It doesn't wear a brand. It begins in silence, grows in struggle, and blossoms where no cameras look. And so, Arav continued. Less on stage, more on soil. Less about being seen, more about seeing. And though the headlines eventually moved on, in 1,000 small corners of the country, lives kept changing quietly, powerfully, because once, a boy with broken shoes refused to stay small. Years later, Arav's name was no longer just whispered in classrooms or conference halls. It had become a quiet force, etched into the dreams of thousands who had nothing but belief to begin with. His legacy wasn't built on fame. It was built on the echoes of lives transformed. He never chased headlines again. But the world kept finding him. One monsoon evening, as clouds gathered over the edge of the skyline, Arav received an unexpected letter. Handwritten, old ink, fragile paper. It was from his father. He hadn't heard from him in years. After his mother's death, their relationship had faded into a silence too painful to visit. But now the words stared back at him. "I was never good with dreams, son. I didn't know how to protect yours. But I watched you from far. I tell everyone, that's my boy, the one who outran destiny." It took him hours to fold the letter back. He traveled home the next morning, back to the village, now older, smaller, quieter. The man who once feared the future stood at his gate, holding a walking stick, and when their eyes met, nothing had to be said. That night, father and son sat on the same rooftop where it all began. No microphones, no audience, just the weight of time and the warmth of forgiveness. But destiny had one final test. The government had launched a national campaign to reform rural education. Arav was approached to lead it. But there was a condition. He had to give up independent control of his programs, merge them into a larger bureaucratic system. It meant compromise. Slower decisions. Less heart, more process. He wrestled with the decision for days. One side told him, "This is the only way to scale what you've started." The other reminded him, "Scale without soul is just noise." Then came a knock on his door. It was a boy, barely 10, holding a torn notebook. "I heard stories happen here," the boy said shyly. "I want to be one." Arav bent down, looked into his eyes, and smiled. "You already are." That night, he tore the contract papers. He would expand, but not at the cost of what made it real. He started building micro-communities instead, local leaders, trained directly by him, empowered to transform from within. No central office, no bureaucracy, just deeply rooted, human-first education. 5 years later, these communities spanned more than 500 districts. Mina's organization had now crossed borders. Ravi, his childhood friend, had returned, now managing rural mental health centers under Arif's vision. And Arif? He wrote again. Not about himself, but about the students who taught him everything. The final chapter of his book ended not with a quote, not with advice, but with a simple sentence. If I can rise from where I was, then so can you from wherever you are. On his 50th birthday, there was no grand celebration, just a circle of children sitting under a banyan tree, listening to his voice. No stage, no lights, just one man, one story, and the endless sky above them. And as the wind passed through the leaves that evening, it carried more than just his words, it carried his journey. Arif never called himself a hero. He never claimed greatness. But in every forgotten street where hope once slept, a little fire burned brighter because he had walked there once, barefoot and unafraid. And the story lives on. Let me tell you. Another story, her name was Mina, but in her village, they now called her Didi with a sword. Years ago, she was the quietest girl in a house full of noise that said, "Girls don't speak, don't dream too big, stay in your place." But when Arif found her, she wasn't looking for freedom. She was looking for a way to breathe without asking for permission. She had once walked 12 kilometers barefoot to hear him speak. Not because she understood everything he said, but because something in his voice made her believe her silence was not permanent. Years passed. Now, Mina stood at the edge of a dusty classroom in a forgotten district. 25 young girls sat before her, some abused, some abandoned, all invisible. She didn't give them lectures. She taught them how to scream. Loud, without shame. She trained them in self-defense, storytelling, law, and dignity. She made them act out scenes where they stood up to the monsters in their homes. She gave them mirrors not to see how they looked, but to meet the warriors hiding behind their fear. But just as her work started growing, threats began to crawl in. One night, she found a note slipped under her door. "Stop teaching girls to fight, or we'll remind you where you belong." The police didn't help. The village elders called her corrupt. Her own uncle accused her of dishonoring the family. For the first time in years, Mina hesitated. That night, she opened a small wooden box where she had kept the first letter Arif ever wrote her. It was barely a sentence. "Don't bend. They only push harder when you lean." She didn't bend. Instead, she started a night school under the trees. Word spread. Girls came in the dark, silent, trembling. They left singing battle songs. The threats grew, but so did the movement. Soon, other villages followed. Mina's name wasn't on national news, but in the hearts of thousands of girls, she was more than a Didi. She was proof. Years later, when Arif visited the district again, Mina didn't hug him. She saluted him. He laughed and said, "No one salutes me." She replied, "You don't see what you've built." But Mina's chapter wasn't the only one burning with purpose. Another story was unfolding hundreds of kilometers away. The boy who once knocked on Arif's door holding a torn notebook, his name was Samir. He had been born in a slum where education was a luxury and childhood was brief. His father died in a factory blast. His mother stitched clothes from dawn till midnight. Samir hated school, not because he didn't want to learn, but because no one had ever believed he could. Until he met Arif. He wasn't given a scholarship. He was given something rarer, a question. "What do you want to fix in this world?" Samir had never been asked that. He said nothing at first. But that night, as he watched his mother's swollen fingers thread another needle, he whispered, "I want to fix hands like hers." He grew up reading science books under a streetlight, soldering wires he found in trash, building models from scrap. By 19, he had developed a low-cost tool to detect early-stage arthritis, using basic circuit boards and a mobile app. People laughed. They said big ideas don't come from narrow alleys. But Arif once told him, "Change doesn't knock. It kicks the damn door open." Samir kicked it open. At 22, he was invited to present his project at an international science fair. He wore his father's old shirt. He stood on stage, stammered twice, forgot his lines, but his invention spoke louder. He didn't win the top prize, but a scientist in the crowd took notice. A few months later, Samir was working in a research lab abroad, leading a team to build affordable health tech for low-income communities. When asked by reporters what inspired him, he didn't say Arif. He simply said, "Someone once believed I could fix the world, so I'm fixing my part." And Arif? He never took credit for their success. He sat on a bench outside a school one evening, watching children run with shoes that fit, books that were theirs, and eyes that didn't fear the future. A teacher beside him asked, "Do you feel proud of what you've built?" Arif didn't answer. He just smiled and said, "It's not what I built. It's what they're becoming." Because his story, his true story, was never about him. It was about Mina, about Samir, about the 1,000 others who rose not from comfort, but from chaos. And if you ever walk through those villages, listen carefully. In the sound of chalk against blackboards, in the echo of a girl's laugh, in the whir of a boy's invention, you'll still hear Arif's story. Not told in words, but lived in legacies. And now, if you're still here, still listening, still holding on to every breath of the story, then maybe, just maybe, there's a fire in you too. Arif's story wasn't about being special. It was about choosing, every single day, not to give up when the world gave him every reason to. He didn't wait for a miracle. He became one not by shouting louder, but by listening deeper. Not by rising alone, but by lifting others. And what about you? You may not have started where you wanted. You may have been pushed, ignored, broken, or betrayed. But if Arif's journey has shown us anything, it's this. Where you begin has nothing to do with how far you can go. So maybe today, you start. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. You stop shrinking for people who don't see your worth. You stop carrying shame that was never yours to hold. You start walking even if your legs tremble. You start believing even if your past still whispers doubt. Because someone, somewhere is waiting for your story, just like you waited for his. And when you feel tired, when the road feels too long, come back here. Let this story remind you. You are not your failures. You are your rise. And if this journey touched you even a little, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it, spread it, live it. And for more stories like this, real, raw, and relentlessly human, subscribe to BookLeesh. This is not just a channel. It's a home for dreamers, fighters, believers. Your next story might just begin here. Thank you for listening. And now, go write your own legacy.